There's something you've already seen before. Not once, not twice, but enough times that it should have stayed with you. And yet, it didn't. It's a cloth, kept in Turin. And on that cloth is the image of a dead man. Not painted, not drawn, not explained. Because this is where most people already make a mistake. They think this is just another religious artifact. It's not. Because if what you're about to see is even partially true, then this isn't a symbol. It's evidence. And here's the part that should bother you. In a country like the United States, where millions of people grew up hearing about Jesus, going to church, celebrating Easter, almost nobody talks about this. Not seriously, not deeply, not for long. You've probably seen it before and did exactly what most people do. You looked, paused, and kept scrolling. And that right there isn't normal, it's a pattern. So let me ask you something. Be honest. The last time you saw anything about the shroud, why didn't you stay? Was it confusing, irrelevant? Or did something in you quietly say, "Not now"? Let me know in the comments below. Because that is where this story actually begins. Imagine this. You're not watching a video anymore. You're there. You walk into a room, not loud, not dramatic. Quiet, controlled, almost sterile. The kind of environment you'd expect in a museum or a high-security archive. Temperature regulated, humidity controlled, nothing left to chance. Because whatever is inside this room matters. The lights are dim, not dark, but low enough that your eyes have to adjust. And as they do, your attention is pulled forward. There's a glass case, centered, still, almost like it's waiting. And inside that glass is something that doesn't look important at first. Just a piece of fabric, long, worn, faded with time. If you saw it anywhere else, you wouldn't stop. You wouldn't take a second look. And that's the part that should already feel strange, because in a country like the United States, where people line up for hours to see something important, this doesn't immediately feel like that. So you do what most people do. You hesitate, then you take one step closer, just one, and something changes. Not dramatically, not instantly, but enough that you don't walk away. Because now you start to see it. At first, it doesn't fully register. Your brain tries to dismiss it. Maybe it's just a stain. Maybe it's a shadow. But then your eyes adjust, and the shape becomes clearer. A face, faint, subtle, almost like it's not trying to be seen. And that's what makes it more unsettling, because most images demand attention. This one doesn't. It just exists. So naturally, you lean in closer. And now you begin to notice something else. It's not just a face, it's a body, front and back. And as your eyes move across the cloth, you begin to see details that make your brain slow down. Marks, patterns, damage, the kind of marks that don't feel random. Whipping, lines across the body, repeated, systematic, piercing, points where the skin appears broken, and then something else, the positioning. The way the body is laid out, it matches something very specific, crucifixion. And now your mind starts connecting dots. Because if you grew up in the United States, you've heard this story before. Jesus, the crucifixion, the wounds. But hearing something and seeing something are not the same thing. Because now you're not imagining it, you're looking at it. And that's when something shifts inside you. Because now your brain starts asking questions, not casual questions, not curiosity, real questions. How is this here? Who made this? What am I actually looking at? So you lean in even closer. And this is where everything starts to break. Because the more you look, the less this behaves like something familiar. This doesn't look painted. There's no pigment, no color layering, no brush strokes. Nothing that suggests a human hand carefully created this. It doesn't look like art. It looks like something left behind. And that's a different category entirely, because now you're not asking, who made this? You're asking, what happened here? And just when your mind starts trying to stabilize, you learn something that makes it worse. Because when scientists analyzed this image, they discovered something that shouldn't be possible. The image contains 3D information, not symbolic, not interpretive, literal depth. Meaning, if you take the brightness levels of the image and process them, you can reconstruct the shape of a human body. Let that sit for a second. This isn't just an image. It behaves like data. And now your brain does something very specific. It stops relaxing. Because this doesn't fit any category you understand. It's not a painting. It's not a photograph. It's not a stain. And yet, it exists right in front of you. And now you're stuck in a place most people don't like being in. Because you don't have an explanation. You have a contradiction. And this is the exact moment where most people make a decision. Not out loud, not consciously, but internally. They step back, they disconnect, they move on. Because staying here means continuing to look at something. That doesn't make sense. And in a world where everything is supposed to make sense, that's uncomfortable. But you didn't step back. You're still here. Which means you've already done something. Most people don't. You stayed. And because you stayed, you're about to see what happens next. At this point, most people do something very predictable. They step back. Not physically at first, but mentally. They look at it, process just enough, and then something inside them says, "That's interesting," and then they move on. Because staying here requires something. It requires time. It requires focus. It requires you to sit with something that doesn't immediately make sense. And if you're watching this from the United States, you already understand how rare that is. Because we live in a world where everything is fast. Scroll, swipe, next video, next headline, next distraction. If something doesn't explain itself quickly, we don't stay long enough to understand it. So most people don't stay. They look and they leave. But let's say you don't. Let's say you resist that instinct. You don't scroll. You don't turn away. You don't mentally check out. You stay. Just a little longer. And that's where something changes. Because the longer you stay, the more details begin to reveal themselves. Not all at once. Slowly. Almost like the image is waiting to see if you're actually paying attention. Now your eyes start adjusting again. And this time, you notice something subtle. Something that most people never get far enough to see. The image doesn't behave like something that was applied to the cloth. It behaves like something that barely touched it. And that difference is everything. Because when something is painted, it sinks into the material. When something is drawn, it leaves marks. When something is created, it builds layers. But this, none of that is happening. The image exists only on the surface. Not soaked in, not embedded, not constructed. Just there, resting lightly on the very top fibers of the linen. So lightly that it almost feels temporary, like it shouldn't still be there, like it was never meant to last this long. And now your brain does something very specific. It starts searching for a comparison. Okay, what is this like? A stain? No. Too precise. Paint? No. Too shallow. A burn? No. Too detailed. And now, you don't have a category, which means your brain can't relax. Because human beings are wired to categorize things. We want to say this is that. That behaves like this. But here, you can't do that. And that creates tension. Real tension. Because now you're not just observing something, you're confronting something. You don't understand. And that's the exact moment where most people leave. Because staying here means continuing to look at something that refuses to fit. But you're still here. So now, we go deeper. Because once scientists started studying this, everything changed. Not gradually, immediately. Because the first thing they realized was that this image behaves differently. at a microscopic level. And this is where it gets even more unsettling. When they zoomed in, not with the naked eye, but with scientific tools, they saw something unexpected. The discoloration of the cloth only affects the outermost fibers. We're talking about something incredibly thin, not threads, fibers, the smallest visible parts of the linen. And even those aren't deeply altered, just slightly changed, like something interacted with them for a fraction of a second and then stopped. Now think about that. Not minutes, not hours, a moment. Something happened, and whatever caused the image was gone just as quickly. And now your mind starts forming a new kind of question. Not, who made this? But, what kind of event leaves a mark like that? Because this isn't just about an image anymore. It's about a process, a moment in time, something that occurred and left behind evidence. And this is where everything starts to feel different, because now you're not looking at something that was created. You're looking at something that happened. And that's a completely different category, because if something happened, then there was a cause. And if there was a cause, then there's an explanation. But here's the problem. The more scientists looked at it, the less clear that explanation became, because every test, every analysis, every attempt to understand it only added more questions. And this is where your brain starts to feel it again, that pressure. Because now, you're not just curious. You're invested, because you stayed. And most people don't. So now the question changes. It's no longer, what is this? It becomes, what happens when the smartest people in the world try to explain something like this and can't agree? Because that's exactly what happened. Scientists stepped in. Not one, not a few. Teams, labs, experts, people trained to explain things, people whose entire careers are built on making sense of the unknown. And when they looked at this, they didn't walk away with clarity. They walked away with conflict. And that's where we're going next. Because what happens when science looks at this is where everything stops being comfortable. And once you see that part, you won't be able to go back to looking at this the same way again. If you're still here, pause. Because most people don't make it this far, not because they can't, but because something in them doesn't want to. So don't just watch this. Subscribe. Because once you start seeing patterns like this, you can't go back. And if you decide not to subscribe, then go to the comments and explain why. Explain why this is where you stop. Let's go back, not to a theory, not to a debate, but to a moment. The year is 1898. No smartphones, no digital cameras, no instant sharing. Photography itself is still evolving, still being understood, still being improved. And in that time, a man named Secondo Pia is given permission to do something simple. Take a photograph. That's it. Nothing groundbreaking, nothing controversial. Just document the cloth. Capture what's already there. Routine, ordinary, expected. But history doesn't always announce when it's about to change. Sometimes it looks exactly like this. A man, a camera, a quiet room. So he sets everything up, carefully, because photography at the time is not quick. It requires precision, timing, patience. The exposure is taken. The plate is captured. And at this point, everything still feels normal. Nothing unusual has happened yet. So he does what every photographer does. He takes the plate and begins the development process. Dark room, chemicals, controlled light. And then something happens, not gradually, instantly, because as the image begins to appear, what he sees doesn't make sense. At first, he probably thinks it's an error. Maybe the exposure was off. Maybe something went wrong. Because what's forming on that plate is clearer, more defined, more real than what was visible on the cloth itself. Let that sit. The negative image is more detailed than the original. This is where your brain should slow down. A cloth, that behaves like a photographic negative before modern photography even existed, before anyone understood how negatives could even function like that, before the technology was advanced enough to intentionally create something like this. And yet, it's already there, waiting to be discovered, not created, not added, revealed. And now imagine being in that room, holding something that just contradicted your understanding of reality. Because this isn't just surprising, it's disorienting. Because now the question isn't what is on the cloth. It becomes, how is the cloth behaving like this? And that's a much harder question to answer, because now you're no longer dealing with art. You're dealing with information, encoded in a way that wasn't supposed to exist yet. And this is the moment everything breaks. Because once this discovery is made, you can't go back. You can't pretend it behaves normally. And more importantly, you can't easily explain it. So naturally, this should have changed everything. It should have sparked global attention, debates, investigations, scientific urgency. But that's not what happened. Instead, something else began to unfold. Because when scientists started looking at it, they expected to find answers. That's what science does. It explains, it categorizes, it resolves. But here, something different happened. The deeper they looked, the less clear things became. Because this image doesn't behave like anything they can reproduce. And this is where it gets worse. Because over time, people tried, artists tried, scientists tried, researchers with advanced tools, modern equipment, high-level understanding. They all attempted to recreate it, to replicate the image, to produce something that behaves the same way. And every time, they failed. Not partially, completely. Because you can create something that looks similar from a distance, but when you zoom in, when you analyze it, when you study its structure, it falls apart. Because it's not the same. It doesn't behave the same. It doesn't carry the same properties. And that's the problem. Because now you're not dealing with something unknown. You're dealing with something that resists being explained. And that creates a different kind of tension. Because in a world like the United States, where science drives progress, where technology explains almost everything, this shouldn't still be a mystery. We can simulate galaxies. We can edit DNA. We can build artificial intelligence that mimics human thought. We can send machines beyond our solar system. And yet, this still stands, unresolved, unrecreated, unexplained. So now the question becomes uncomfortable. Not, what is it? But, why hasn't it been explained yet? Because that's a different kind of question. That question starts to feel personal. Because now, you're not just observing a mystery. You're confronting a gap. A gap between what we can do and what we still don't understand. And that gap is where people start to pull back. Because staying here means accepting something difficult. That not everything fits into the system we trust. And that's where the divide begins. Because now, you're standing in that moment, looking at something that shouldn't exist. And you have a choice. Do you lean in and follow it further? Or do you step back and return to what feels safe? Because history shows most people step back. Not because they're weak, but because staying here comes with a cost. The cost of uncertainty, the cost of discomfort, the cost of asking questions. You might not be ready to answer, but you didn't step back. You're still here, which means you're about to see what happens next. Because when science tries to resolve this, it doesn't bring clarity, it brings conflict, and that is where everything changes again. Stop. Don't let this turn into background noise, because this is the exact moment most people mentally check out. Not because they're bored, but because this is where it starts costing something to stay. Now something happens. Not to the cloth, not to the image, to people. Because the moment something cannot be easily explained, people don't stay neutral. They choose sides. And that's exactly what happens here. Two groups form, not gradually, not quietly, but inevitably. Because human beings are not comfortable sitting in uncertainty. We want resolution. We want clarity. We want a conclusion we can live with. So the moment the Shroud refuses to give that, the divide begins. On one side, you have those who say, it's fake. Not maybe, not possibly. Fake. Medieval. Meaning it belongs to a time period where people created religious artifacts, where relics were produced, where beliefs sometimes outran evidence, already explained, which is a powerful statement because it shuts the door. It says, there's nothing more to see here. And for a lot of people, especially in the United States, that kind of certainty feels safe. Because we're trained to trust conclusions. If something has been debunked, we move on. We don't revisit it. We don't question it again. We accept it. And that's one side of the divide. But then, there's the other side. And they're saying something very different. Not emotional, not dramatic, but precise. This doesn't behave normally. Not. It's a miracle. Not. It proves everything. Just. This doesn't match anything we understand. And that's a very different kind of statement. Because it doesn't close the conversation, it opens it. We don't have a mechanism for this. Meaning, there is no known process, no clear explanation, no reproducible method that produces the same result. And in science, that matters. Because science isn't just about what you believe. It's about what you can demonstrate, what you can repeat, what you can test, what you can explain. And here, something is missing. Not data, but explanation. So now you have two positions. One that says, we already know what this is. And one that says, we don't know what this is. Same cloth, same evidence, different conclusions. And this is where things start to feel uncomfortable, because both sides agree on something important, something you can't ignore. That whatever this is, it's not normal. That part isn't debated. What's debated is what that means, and this is where the tension becomes real. Because now you're not just observing information, you're watching interpretation. You're watching how people process something. That doesn't fit neatly into their worldview. And if you're watching this from the United States, you've seen this pattern before. Not just with religion, but with science, politics, health, history. The same information, presented to different people, leading to completely different conclusions. And it forces a question, not about the Shroud, but about us. How do we decide what's true when the evidence doesn't point clearly in one direction? Do we go with what feels safer, or do we stay in the tension and keep asking questions? Because that's the real divide, not between believers and skeptics, but between people who are willing to sit with uncertainty and those who aren't. And that's where things start to get personal, because now you're not just watching two groups argue. You're starting to feel the pull yourself. You feel the part of your mind that wants to resolve this quickly, to say, okay, it's fake, or okay, it's real, just to end the tension. But the moment you do that, you stop investigating. And that's exactly what has happened for most people. They didn't reach a conclusion through deep understanding. They reached it to escape discomfort. And now we're back to something important. Because if you've stayed this long, you've already done something different. You didn't rush to a conclusion. You stayed in the tension. And that changes how you see this. Because now, you're not just asking, which side is right? You're asking, why does this create such a strong divide in the first place? Because that's the deeper question. Why does something like this pull people in completely opposite directions? Why does the same evidence lead to confidence on one side and uncertainty on the other? And this is where the story shifts again. Because now, it's not just about the Shroud. It's about how truth behaves when it doesn't fit expectations. Because when something confirms what we already believe, we accept it quickly. But when something challenges it, We resist it. We question it more aggressively. We scrutinize it more deeply. Or we dismiss it entirely. And that's happening here, right now. Not just in the world, but inside you. Because whether you realize it or not, you're starting to lean. Not fully, not consciously, but slightly. And that's the moment that matters, because that's where decisions are made. Not out loud, but internally. And most people don't even notice it happening. They just wake up with the conclusion and assume it came from evidence. But what if it didn't? What if it came from something else? Comfort, familiarity, expectation. And that possibility is where things start to get even more uncomfortable. Because now, you're not just evaluating the shroud, you're evaluating yourself. And most people don't like doing that for long. This is the point where most people drift. They keep watching, but stop thinking. Don't do that. Like this video, share it. Because ignoring something doesn't make it disappear. It just delays the moment you have to face it. And if you won't subscribe, say it clearly in the comments below. Say why you'd rather stay comfortable. Now let's go deeper. Not into theory, not into belief, into testing. Because at some point, this stops being philosophical and becomes measurable. Carbon dating. If you're watching this from the United States, you've heard of it before. It's one of the most trusted tools in modern science, used to determine age, used in archaeology, used in forensics, used to settle questions about the past. It doesn't rely on opinion. It doesn't rely on belief. It relies on decay, the predictable breakdown of carbon over time. Meaning, if something is old, this method should tell you. So when scientists applied carbon dating to the Shroud of Turin, they expected clarity. Not debate, not confusion. Clarity. And the results came back. Medieval. Roughly between the 13th and 14th century. And just like that, for many people, the case was closed, because that's how we're trained to think. If the data says something clearly, you accept it. You move on. You don't revisit it. You don't question it again, especially in a culture like the United States, where scientific authority carries weight, where conclusions matter, where evidence is expected to settle things. So, for a moment, everything seemed resolved. It's medieval. It's not what people think. It's already been explained. And if the story ended there, this wouldn't be a mystery. But it didn't end there, because almost immediately, something began to push back. Not emotionally, not dramatically, scientifically. Other researchers stepped in, and they didn't say the test is fake. They said something more specific. Something about the sample may be wrong. And that's a very different kind of problem. Because now, you're not arguing about belief. You're questioning the process. Wrong sample. Meaning, the piece of fabric that was tested may not represent the original cloth. Contamination. Meaning, over hundreds of years, the cloth could have been exposed to elements, smoke, touch, environmental factors that altered the results. Repaired fibers. Meaning, sections of the cloth may have been restored, woven with newer material, changing the dating outcome. And now, everything starts to shift again, because this isn't a simple disagreement. This is a conflict between methods. On one side, you have a widely accepted scientific test, giving a clear answer. On the other, you have scientists saying that answer might not apply here. And now, you're no longer dealing with certainty. You're dealing with contradiction. And this is where things become unavoidable. Because now you can't just say, it's fake. But you also can't confidently say, it's real. You're stuck. And that's a position most people don't like being in, because human beings prefer clarity. We want to know, yes or no, true or false, real or fake. But here, you don't get that. You get tension. Because now the question becomes deeper. Carbon dating says one thing, but the image itself behaves in ways that medieval technology couldn't produce. And that's not speculation. That's observation. No pigments, surface-level image, 3D information, photographic negative properties. All of these characteristics don't align with what we know about that time period. So now you're forced into a position where two realities exist at the same time. One says, the cloth is medieval. The other says, the image shouldn't exist if that's true. And both are supported by evidence. Let that sit, because this is where the real conflict begins. Not between people, but between explanations. And now, you have to make a decision. Not out loud, not publicly, but internally. Do you trust the test or question the conditions under which it was performed? Do you accept the conclusion or investigate the contradiction? And this is where the pressure builds, because no matter what you choose, something doesn't fully resolve. If you trust the carbon dating, you still have to explain the image. If you question the carbon dating, you still have to explain why it produced that result. Either way, you don't escape the problem. You stay in it. And that's why this is the conflict you can't escape, because it doesn't allow you to walk away with a clean answer. It forces you to sit in something unfinished. And in a culture like the United States, where everything is optimized for clarity, for speed, for quick conclusions, this kind of unresolved tension feels unnatural, almost uncomfortable. But that discomfort is where the truth usually hides, because the moment something becomes difficult to resolve, people start doing something predictable. They simplify it, they reduce it, they choose the explanation that requires the least effort, not necessarily the most accurate one. And that's what may have happened here, because instead of fully resolving the contradiction, most people picked a side and stopped asking questions. But you didn't. You're still here. Up until now, this has been about information, a cloth, an image, science, history, things you can observe without being affected. But this part moves closer, because now this isn't about historians, it's not about scientists, it's not about religious leaders, it's not about debates on television or articles online or opinions you've heard before. Now, it's about you. Because everything we've gone through so far leads to a point where you can't stay neutral anymore. You can't just say, that's interesting. You can't just observe it and walk away the same way you came in. Because now, there's a weight attached to it, a consequence. And this is where the shift happens. Because the question is no longer, what is the shroud? The question becomes, what does it mean if it's real? And that's where people start to feel it, that pressure, because suddenly, this is no longer a historical object. It becomes a possibility, and possibilities can change things. So let's slow this down. If the shroud is fake, nothing changes. You go back to your life. Your understanding of history stays the same. Your beliefs stay where they are. Your assumptions about Jesus, about faith, about reality, remain untouched. Everything stays predictable, comfortable, contained, and there's a certain kind of relief in that. Because nothing is being challenged, nothing is being disrupted. You don't have to revisit anything. You don't have to rethink anything. You don't have to confront anything. You can move on, and that's what most people do. But now, we have to consider the other side, because if the shroud is real, everything changes, not slightly, completely. Because now, you're not dealing with a symbol, you're dealing with evidence, and evidence demands a response. Because if this image was formed by something we don't fully understand, if it reflects a real event, if it connects to the story you've heard your entire life, then every assumption you've made has to be re-examined. And that's not comfortable, that's disruptive. Because now, you have to ask questions you may have avoided. Questions like, what if this actually happened? What if this isn't just a story? What if everything I thought was symbolic has a physical trace? And those questions don't stay theoretical. They become personal. Because if something like this is real, then it doesn't just affect history, it affects meaning, purpose, truth. And that's where people begin to pull back. Not because they don't understand, but because they do. Because understanding leads to implication. And implication leads to responsibility. And responsibility is where things get real. Because now, you're not just observing evidence, you're deciding what to do with it. And that's the moment most people avoid, not consciously, but instinctively. Because staying here means accepting that something might be true. That requires change, and change is uncomfortable, especially in a world like the United States, where people value independence, control, certainty, where belief is often treated as something personal, private, optional. But this doesn't stay private, because if it's real, it reaches into everything, not just what you believe, but how you live. And that's why this moment matters. Because now, you're standing at a point where two paths exist, one that keeps everything the same, and one that forces you to rethink everything. And neither one feels easy, because choosing comfort means ignoring something that doesn't fully make sense, and choosing to investigate further means stepping into uncertainty. And that's the tension, real tension, not about facts, but about what you're willing to face. Because this isn't just about whether the shroud is real, it's about whether you're willing to follow that possibility, wherever it leads. And most people don't. They stop here, they step back, they tell themselves it's probably nothing, not because they've fully examined it, but because it's easier. And now, we're back to something important. Because earlier, we asked why people ignore this, and now you can feel the answer. It's not lack of evidence. It's not lack of information. It's the cost. The cost of staying, the cost of considering, the cost of accepting that something might be true, that changes more than you expected. And that's why this moment matters. Because right now, you're doing something different. You didn't scroll away. You didn't shut it down. You stayed. And that means you've already crossed a line most people never do. But now, there's one more step, because staying isn't the same as deciding, and this is where you decide. If you've made it this far, you already know this isn't just a video. So don't scroll away now. Subscribe, because what comes next is the part most people avoid completely. And if you don't subscribe, then go to the comments and explain why you stopped right here. Why this is where you decided not to go deeper. There is a theory, not a casual idea, not a surface-level explanation. A theory that attempts to account for everything you've seen so far. The surface-level image, the lack of pigments, the 3D information, the photographic negative behavior, all of it. And here's the part that makes it difficult to ignore. This theory doesn't just explain one detail, it explains the entire pattern. And at the same time, it creates a new kind of tension, because if this theory is even remotely possible, then what you're looking at is not just an image, it's the result of an event, a moment, something that happened and left behind evidence. And according to this idea, that event happened in an instant, not gradually, not over time, not through human effort, but suddenly. A burst, energy, an event powerful enough to affect the surface of the cloth without burning it, without destroying it, without penetrating it, just enough to leave a mark and then stop. This is where your mind starts reacting, because this doesn't fit comfortably into anything you've learned, not in school, not in science class, not in everyday experience, because when we think of energy, we think of heat, damage, destruction. But here, you have something precise, controlled, something that interacts with matter without behaving like typical energy. And that's where scientists begin to describe it differently. Some call it radiation, not in the sense of nuclear explosion, but in the sense of energy transfer. Something emitted, something released, something that affected the outermost fibers for a fraction of a second. Others describe it as unknown physics, meaning we don't currently have a framework that fully explains what we're seeing, not because it's impossible, but because it doesn't fit our current understanding. And that's an important distinction, because in science, unknown doesn't mean unreal. It means not yet explained. But then there's another group, and they use a different word, not radiation, not physics. They call it the resurrection. Because now, you're no longer dealing with a neutral theory. You're dealing with a conclusion that carries weight. Because if that's what this is, then this isn't just evidence of a process. It's evidence of an event that redefines everything. And this is where people split. Not gradually, instantly. Because now the question isn't, what does the evidence say? The question becomes, what are you willing to accept? Because two people can look at the same information, the same patterns, the same unexplained details, and walk away with completely different conclusions. One says, this must have a natural explanation we haven't found yet. The other says, this points to something beyond what we understand. Same evidence, different interpretations, and this is where the divide becomes clear. Because at this level, it's no longer about data. It's about worldview. It's about the framework you use to interpret what you're seeing. And if you're watching this from the USA, you've seen this pattern before. In science, in history, in culture. Evidence rarely speaks for itself. See, people interpret it through what they're already willing to believe. And that's what's happening here, because the possibility being presented is not just difficult to explain, it's difficult to accept. Because accepting it means stepping into something bigger, something that goes beyond mechanics, beyond chemistry, beyond physics as we currently understand it. And that's where resistance begins. Not because the idea lacks structure, but because of what it implies. Because if this was formed by something like a resurrection, then you're no longer dealing with theory. You're dealing with reality. And reality demands a response. And that's the moment most people avoid. Not because they haven't seen the information, but because they understand what it points toward. And they're not ready to go there. So they step back. They choose a safer explanation. They say, it's probably something else. Not because they've resolved it, but because it keeps everything stable. And that's the tension. Because this possibility doesn't force you to believe it, but it doesn't let you ignore it either. It just sits there, unresolved, waiting. And now, you're in that space, between explanation and implication, between what you know and what you might have to reconsider. And that's where the real decision begins. Because from here, there's no neutral ground. You either lean in and follow the possibility further, or you step back and return to what feels familiar. And most people step back. But you didn't. You're still here. And that means you're closer to something most people never fully confront. Not just the shroud, but what it might actually represent. You've seen it now, not as a headline, not as something you scroll past, but for what it actually is. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The Shroud of Turin, it was never hidden from you. It was shown to you, just not in a way that made you stay. And now, you don't get to say you didn't know, because you did. You saw it. You understood it. And now the only question left is, what are you going to do with it? If you made it this far, you already know. This wasn't just a video, so don't treat it like one. Subscribe, because the conversations happening here are the ones most people avoid until it's too late. And if you choose not to, go to the comments and say it clearly. Say why you're okay, ignoring something like this. Because in the next video, we will explore something even more mysterious, titled Mel Gibson. The Ethiopian Bible story reveals the truth behind what everyone believed about Jesus. I will link it immediately at the end of this video. See you there. Good night and God bless you.